Welcome back to SelfWork. I'm Dr. Margaret. Today we're going to be talking about the roles or the jobs you may have played in your family. But first, let's hear from sponsors. This is SelfWork, and I'm Dr. Margaret Rutherford. At SelfWork, we discuss psychological and emotional issues and what you can do about them, whether that's learning self-acceptance, taking action, or seeking therapy or treatment. 8 years ago, I extended the walls of my practice to reach those of you who might already be knowledgeable about mental health treatment, but also to those of you who might say you'd never darken the door of a therapist. And yet, you are here. I'll answer your questions while I invite you to take a few minutes for your own self-work. I'd suggest you try this. Write about what role or job you played or were given in your family. Maybe even label your siblings or just talk with them about it if you have the kind of family that can do that objectively. If not, maybe you have friends from when you were a child that you could talk about this with. How did they see your family? Welcome to this week's edition of SelfWork. Most of us love to take tests like the Enneagram or the Myers-Briggs to find out what that test might have to say about your personality style or your strengths and vulnerabilities. But something you might also gravitate to in thinking about what's called your family of origin or the family you grew up in, you might be interested in talking about the roles each of the children played in the family. The 6 most agreed upon roles are the hero, the scapegoat, the lost child, the mascot, the caretaker or enabler, and the golden child. And we'll go through all of these in detail. So today we're going to keep it simple, talk about the role you played in your family, and maybe even the role you're still playing in that family. And as always, what can you do about it if you're not profiting from it in a healthy way? The listener voicemail is from a young woman who recognizes her role as the golden child in her family, as the one who can make no mistakes in a parent's eyes. And she brings the issue of seeing her mom, who is working on her own self-improvement. She's seeing her mom treat her sister very differently than she treats her. She's asking me what could she do about it. I'll have some ideas for her and you. First, let's hear from AG1, a drink I consume almost every morning. Sometimes I forget, but I know it's a great source of energy for me. When AG1 first approached me about sponsoring SelfWork, I of course had to try it. I not only loved it because I could tell an improvement in my overall energy level, I could tell a difference in how my body felt. How even with my busy schedule, I could count on my body doing what it was supposed to do every day. And now there are studies being published showing that what I've been feeling is backed up by science. In one study, 97% of participants felt digestion improved after 90 days of drinking AG1. And in another, the actual composition of the microbes in your gut changed for the better. Add that to the fact that AG1 is in powder form, so it's easier for your body to digest. What good is a supplement if your body can absorb and use it? So start with AG1 and notice the difference for yourself. It's a great first step to investing in your health, and that's why they've been a proud partner of mine for so long. Try AG1 and get a free bottle of vitamin D3K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase at drinkag1.com/selfwork. That's a $48 value for free if you go to drinkag1.com/selfwork. Check it out. I did a lot of theater in high school and college, and even as an adult when I could. It was quite challenging to try to dig deep into your gut and your heart and begin to realize and then play a character. I was reminded of that when I began to research the topic for today of describing what the roles are that children take on or play in their families. Let me be quick to say these aren't really quote unquote played as if the child was acting out something. In fact, it's often the parents themselves that see their children in a certain way, and that seeing can cause the child to think of their own identity in that way. For example, let's say you had an older sibling who excelled in school. You were good at school, but didn't do quite as well, but you did real well at soccer, or you made friends very easily. Your parents could have labeled your sibling the smart one, but you were left with the athletic one or the friendly one. Or, of course, those labels could have been much more harsh, the troublemaker or the backtalker. So these kinds of labels are very rigid ways to describe a child, and unfortunately, it's kind of a bad habit that many parents have. I'm not real sure how it makes their life easier, but it's not a great thing to do. In fact, it's a mistake. Your children have strengths, and those strengths need to be seen and celebrated. But a parent can also label that child, as I said, far too rigidly or far too harshly. So when I have parents come in a session and they're talking about their children in this way, I'll usually talk to them about Winnie the Pooh. And yes, they look at me fairly strangely. But I'll ask them to name the different characters. And if they know the story at all, they'll remember it was Tigger, Rabbit, Owl, Winnie, and Piglet, and of course, Eeyore. And maybe others. But then I ask them what the strengths were of each one of the characters. And if they can't name a strength, then I'll help them figure it out. Tigger had enthusiasm and lots of energy. Owl, patience and wisdom. Winnie, empathy, and I think curiosity. He's always asking questions. Piglet, finding courage when afraid. Rabbit's very organized. And even Eeyore, for all his melancholic self, often said the thing that was hard about something, and it was accurate. But all of the characters had their challenges as well. These traits also became challenges, just as we do as humans. Sometimes the very thing that you like about yourself, and maybe the thing that others admire about you, has a more painful or potentially difficult side to it. Like with the Pooh characters. Rabbit, kind of bossy. Tigger is reactive and impulsive. Owl is a kind of know-it-all. So why am I bringing up Winnie the Pooh? Because today we're talking about the role you might have played in your family. And there are about 6 that are the generally agreed upon roles. You can get kind of crazy. I've seen a list as many as 13, 14, or 15. But what I want you to hear me say loudly and clearly is that your role, whether it was decided for you by family dynamics or if your natural personality traits came through and then were labeled by your family, and then you turn around and identified with it pretty strongly, that label is actually far from all of you. Just like a diagnosis in mental health or mental illness doesn't explain who you are, neither does a role that you might have played or a job you might have had in your family. I'm pulling from a really good article by Heidi Priebe, that's Priebe in Medium, about this dynamic of how these roles or jobs are created within the family. I'm going to quote her. Each child has a specific job in the family. The jobs are not explicitly stated, nor are they consciously assigned by the parents. Rather, they are reinforced through a subtle reward and punishment system that takes place over the duration of the child's upbringing. They're not offered specific roles so much as they are forced into them. It's an interesting point. She says that they're never explicitly stated, but I think sometimes they are. I'm not sure I agree with that. But certainly, just like the example I used before of saying, oh, he's the athletic one or she's the smart one, that's often very consciously given. These roles we're going to talk about today, probably not so much. Again, as I said in the intro, the 6 most commonly agreed upon roles are the hero, the scapegoat, the lost child, the mascot, the caretaker or enabler, and the golden child. First, let's talk about the hero. If you've heard me talk about perfectly hidden depression, it might make great sense to you to think of the hero child as a setup for this problem. The hero's job is to go out in the world and make a hugely successful splash with the purpose of causing others to admire the family or the parents. And then they themselves may not understand or see the imperfections in their own families or cultures because they're so distracted by staying busy and achieving success. It's a never-ending job, which is the obvious problem. You're always needing to prove your hero-dom to somebody else. And so how Dr. Gordon Flett talks about destructive perfectionism, he says, it's like you're on a treadmill with no power over the incline or the speed. You must constantly achieve. So the vulnerability here lies in the immense pressure that's occurring inwardly, but outwardly, it's your job to seem perfect. What about the scapegoat? I remember when I trained at Southwest Family Institute during graduate school, And this was a cool place to intern because there was actually one of those one-way mirrors, and we would watch each other do therapy with different families. It was also very nerve-wracking, but I learned a lot by watching other therapists. But this is what we were told. Often there's an identified patient, the person in the family who seemed to be the troubled one or the source of conflict. What we were taught was the scapegoat, or the identified patient, was also the one who was probably telling a good deal of truth about the dysfunction of the family and the fact that their actions pointed that out, or that they made the family look bad, and then they were told they were the problem, and thus sometimes they became the problem. This isn't always true, mind you, but it often is. So if I had a really depressed teenager, for example, in the family, I would often turn to the teenager and say, "Can you tell me what's wrong here? What's your take on this?" And often what you'll get is somewhat of a reflection of what you are also thinking as the therapist. But the problem, of course, is the scapegoat often is filled with self-loathing or feels to blame for everything, which doesn't set them up well for the future. Now, if you can imagine what kind of problems there could be going on between the hero and the scapegoat. The hero can literally hate the scapegoat and vice versa. But what does the scapegoat look like later in life when they're trying to have adult relationships or intimate relationships? The scapegoat can assume a one-down position and take the blame. Or they may have become rebellious and fight even viciously for some kind of control in that relationship. Now, the hero is often going to look for someone else who's another hero. But there's not a lot of emotional intimacy going on in those relationships because their lives are about achievement, not intimacy. So let's take a break, and we'll be back in just a moment. Did you know that perimenopause can begin as early as 35 or 40? If you're a woman, you may have experienced subtle hormonal changes much earlier than we used to believe menopause began, and you don't know what to do or where to get really good information. Perimenopause, or the years prior to the time when your body begins to slow down and eventually stop menstruating, it's a natural process, as is menopause itself. But that doesn't mean they don't have their own unique difficulties. Certainly, perimenopause threw me for some emotional loops, and some of those loops can be heavily intertwined with mental and emotional struggles. The good news is you don't have to suffer through it anymore, because now we have Hormone Harmony, a formula made only with herbal ingredients that are shown to reduce hormonal symptoms in women of all ages. It's become a phenomenon. Women cannot stop talking about it. A bottle of Hormone Harmony is sold every 24 seconds. That's 50 orders in the time it takes you to listen to SelfWork. Now, for a limited time, you could get 15% off your entire first order at happymammoth.com. Just use the code SelfWork at checkout. That's happymammoth.com and use the code SelfWork for 15% off today. Then there's the lost child. This is the child who remains basically invisible, the one who doesn't cause problems, who stays quiet. They may seem very flexible, they go with the flow kind of child. They may be even overly compliant, but they've learned that staying out of the way keeps them safe. Imagine what kind of relationship the lost child will look for as an adult. Maybe they'll remain invisible and be attracted to a relationship where they can stay in the shadows. Maybe they're going to be dominated or controlled, and again, stay quiet. They may even have such difficulty believing in themselves enough to have an intimate relationship that they don't have one. So as you think about these first three, it can be helpful to begin to see how you identified with your job in your family, and are you still doing it now? Maybe in your family of origin, but also in your what's called your family of creation, the family you are creating in the here and now. Let's move on to the mascot. I often found myself playing this role in my family. I was also my mother's golden child, by the way, but often I was the mascot. I was the youngest. I could make people laugh. I was always doing funny things. My nickname was Miss Priss, and I earned every letter of it. And I was the only girl. Now, later in life, I shifted, in my own eyes at least, I'm not sure in my family's, into a black sheep as I went about the job of creating chaos in my relationships in my life. My antics weren't so funny anymore, but that's kind of a tangent. Maybe you're beginning to see yourself in one or more of these roles. And again, I was the mascot, and then in my own eyes, I turned into a real black sheep. And then all along that, I was definitely the golden child from my mother, which we'll talk about in a minute. So maybe you went from role to role, or you shifted your roles. That's very possible. Or maybe you got stuck in one. The caretaker enabler is a child who takes on the role or the job of the parent when the parent or parents themselves are crippled by addictions or personality problems that are so bad that they cannot manage their own families. It's enabling because inadvertently, since the child fixes things, the parent can continue the addiction or mental emotional problem without much consequence. Without knowing it, the child enables the problem to continue by correcting the problem caused by the parent. It's a true setup for the child to become way too responsible and burdened with problems they didn't create. So, what do caretaker enablers do in their adult lives and when they're looking for relationships? They're fixers. So they're either going to be attracted to people who need fixing or who don't take a lot of responsibility. And it's an unhealthy fit, but it's a recognizable fit. It's a fit that is known to the person. Oh, yeah, this is what I do best. I fix things. And last but not least, there's the golden child. Later in the episode, we're going to hear from one such golden child. You might wonder if the hero and the golden child are one and the same. But no, the golden child isn't driven to prove to the world that their family is great. They're literally chosen by one or both parents as the one who can do no wrong. There's still an immense amount of pressure, just like the hero. Let's go back to the article by Miss Preeb. The golden child's job is to adopt and live out the patient's moral code. The parent may unconsciously see this child as a mini-spouse and confide in them to an inappropriate extent, subtly relying on them for emotional support. This is known or has been called emotional incest. The golden child often grows up driven by guilt, in part because they feel responsible for their parents' emotions, and in part because they are, on some level, aware of the fact that they have escaped more overt forms of abuse that one or more of their siblings faced. You're going to hear that later in our listener voicemail. This is similar and akin to what you may have heard me talk about as enmeshment, when a child is pulled into a relationship with a parent as a caregiver or confidant. And I'll have a link for you on enmeshment in the show notes. It's one of my most read articles on the website and one of the most listened to podcasts. What's so sad for the golden child is that they may not be able to see or be honest with themselves about their very real struggles as an adult. They're golden, after all. And if they don't realize the purpose they're still serving for their parent or parents, the job that they are still doing, then bonding with another adult as an adult and making that bond primary will be very difficult. They can attract someone who's harsh and highly controlling. After all, the parent who pulls the golden child into his or her life is very controlling and expects a lot. So that child may have learned that love is equal with control. And that can cause huge problems, for the golden child is then in a fight between partner and parent. But on the flip side of that, and I had this actually pointed out to me, it was very, very helpful observation. Actually, the golden child might also be attracted to someone who has the power to pull them out of that dynamic with their biological parent. Not that that dynamic is recognized or even conscious. You can imagine if you are allied with a parent, very, very strong. You talk to them 2 and 3 times a day. You tell them all about your life. You listen to all the things about theirs. Then when you try as an adult to have a primary bond, a partnership, maybe even a marriage with someone else, that affiliation, that alliance with that biological parent is going to be a problem. So it's helpful for the golden child to see that they might be attracted to someone very, very strongly who their biological parent does not like and does not approve of. And so they are pulled between partner and parent, but in some ways, hopefully it can get them to look at how dominant their parent is in their life. So what to do with this information? I'd suggest you try this. Write about what role or job you played or were given in your family. Maybe even label your siblings or just talk with them about it, if you have the kind of family that can do that objectively. If not, maybe you have friends from when you were a child that you could talk about this with. How did they see your family, your relationship with your parents? It can be very helpful to talk with friends who knew you when about the family you grew up in and what they noticed and observed. Then, of course, the next step is to look to see how you may be viewing your own children too rigidly. Instead, write down what is each child's strength and what's their vulnerability. Talk with your partner about the language you're both using to describe them when you talk about them, because it can be damaging. It can be limiting. If I want to go back to my Winnie the Pooh analogy, you got to think each of the characters had strengths and weaknesses, and they were all important to the story. Last week, I watched half of the film Inside Out. I'll watch the other half, hopefully, as I was doing some writing about anxiety and panic disorder. If you haven't seen it, I'd highly recommend it. It's one of those children's films that adults enjoy as well. But you can see and hear how all the feelings, even those that emerged when the human character reached puberty, all the emotions had good things to offer and could also be difficult. And you can think of all the jobs that our emotions do. They give us the ability to feel joy, to pick up on danger, to be creative, to plan, whatever. It's similar here, where whatever role you played or job you performed in the family where you grew up, there were helpful and unhelpful things about those families and what you were expected to do or be.
Speak Pipe message from drmargaretrutherford.com.
Let's get to the SpeakPipe voicemail for today.
Hi there. So my mom is pretty unstable, but she recognizes it and is definitely trying to do better, but sometimes she does lash out on my sister. And so as the sibling that's kind of the golden child that I think my parents listen to more, what is my place in that? Should I try to confront my mom about what she's doing since she's in that place where she wants to grow? Or will that be putting a wedge between me and my mom purely because of a relationship she has with my sister? Thank you.
She's already said she believes she's been seen as the golden child by her mom and feels a little guilty for her sister getting the brunt of her mother's past and some present harshness. But maybe you can also hear her trying to decide if she should intervene and has the hope or the belief that she could fix things between her mother and sister. So now we're hearing a little caretaker, right? Not just golden child. So if this listener doesn't need or want to be the golden child anymore, her job isn't to enable or fix anything. I know what she's thinking. If I say something to mom, then she might listen. She can take a little constructive criticism from me better than she could from someone else. And I get it. But does that really change the dynamic in the long run? Even if her comment worked and her mom listened and corrected her behavior slightly, the dynamic might stay the same because she's not in control of her mom's thoughts. What I'd suggest instead is that she invite her mom and her sister to go into family therapy. Just have a couple of sessions and let a therapist do the work of helping her mom see her harshness with her sister. Or it actually may be that the therapist might see something else in this family that's important. Maybe about the listener, maybe about her sister. After all, you're getting a perspective in therapy. You're getting a consult. Do you see what I see? You can't really be a therapist to your own friends and family. I hope I've never tried. If any of them are listening, you can tell me. But my best suggestion to this golden child is to not take the job of family fixer-upper. I hope that's helpful to you. I'm real excited about this spring in 2025. I'm going up to Illinois to talk to some asphalt workers. I'm going to Florida to talk with some philanthropists. I'm going to Atlanta to talk to a group who've lost a lot of their young people to suicide. And I'm speaking here in Northwest Arkansas at this huge firefighter and EMS consortium training. I'd love to come to you. You can contact me through my website, drmargaretrutherford.com. and we can talk about it. And while you're there, you can subscribe to drmargaretrutherford.com. And I'll be so delighted to have you as a recipient of just one newsletter a week that gives you my weekly podcast as well as my weekly blog post and anything else. Like I wrote a Psychology Today article on self-hatred last week and included that in the newsletter for yesterday. I'd also love to have you in my Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/selfwork. It's a closed group. As always, please take very good care of yourself, your loved ones, and your community. Thank you for being here. I'm Dr. Margaret, and this has been SelfWork.